the city of Toronto, Canada, is approximately 10% Muslim. The city of Berlin is much more than 10% Muslim. In fact, 7% of the population of Berlin is of Turkish cultural origin. Imagine we were to ask the question, did the people of Hungary accept that by joining the European Union, embracing Westernization and liberalism, that they were committing to having a population more than 10% Muslim in each of their cities, or even specifically a population largely Turkish? These countries, Hungary, Romania, so on, their whole history has been defined by a struggle against the Turks. Wars against the Ottoman Empire and the modern state of Turkey as the successor to the Ottoman Empire. That is, in brief, the history of this expanse of what we call Eastern Europe, sometimes we call Central Europe, the nations in between Russia and the West. All these definitions are odious. Just in stating the matter so bluntly, we must sound right-wing. There's nothing conservative about it. You would never hear Rory Stewart raise this question. You would never hear Boris Johnson raise this question. Conservatives do not think this way, do not talk this way, do not think about history this way, and they don't think about the present that's unfolding now. So, we pretend that countries like Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, that they chose to embrace Westernization and liberalism. Well, if you had actually presented them with the opportunity to vote, if you had presented them with a referendum, do you accept having a society where in all of your major cities, 10% of the population is Muslim? The people of Hungary would say no, and the people of Romania would say no.
When I talk about changing of identity, I don't mean political. It's about sexual. It's about cultural identity. Coming and being Austrian suddenly became very easy. And I do believe this easiness is scary, because when you look back historically, particularly with a big kind of assimilation migration story, there are always two very different fears. One is that those foreigners who come, they're never going to be like us. That there is a kind of a border which they are never going to go, they're never going to be totally assimilated. But 1930s and Nazi anti-Semitism was driven by a different fear, that they can become like us. And if they can become like us, who are we? If everybody can become Bulgarian, what it means to be Bulgarian? This kind of a fear of universal nature. And I do believe as a result of it, there comes people who basically start and saying, no, it's not just a cultural change, it's biological, they're kind of a true Bulgarians, others. And today I was seeing some data. Do you know that in Austria, as a percent of the population, you have more foreign-born population than in Canada? Suddenly people start to believe that all these European states, they're not really migrant societies. The real migrant societies are Americans, Canadians, and so on. And suddenly you see a different reality. Before, the idea was that people can move in space, but they cannot move in time. And this is why, by the way, the first book on time traveler is 19th century, at the end of 19th century. Suddenly now, every movement of space is becoming also a movement in time. People coming, for example, to the West, having the feeling that you're moving to the future. And all these voters voting for the far right, they believe that the only way to travel back in time is with the ballot.
And walks into a doctor's office and says, "You've got to help me. I've had these terrible pains throughout my whole body ever since this limb was severed. Sometimes I feel as if it's talking to me, as if it's still there. I think, this is what people call phantom limb syndrome. The doctor says, well, I'm sorry, but I'm a man of science. Okay? I don't believe in witchcraft. I'm not your therapist or psychologist. Okay? I deal with hard scientific facts. What you are saying in complaining to me this way, it is really a very one-sided, biased perspective. The patient who's walked into the doctor's, he says, well, doctor, I don't understand. What do you mean? The doctor says, less than 6 hours ago, your left arm came in here. And he says that he feels he's the only real thing in this relationship. And he's so glad to have been cut off from a whole phantom person.
For us, 1989 was only the fall of the Berlin Wall. Look from now on back. Is it not that Tiananmen can turn to be more important than the fall of the Berlin Wall? The resilience of the Chinese Communist Party to keep power? On the other side, we remember 1989 as a kind of a liberal year. But this was also the year in which Milosevic made his famous speech in Kosovo. We are talking only about the great excursion of East Germans going to West Germany. But there was a big excursion of 300,000 Bulgarian Turks being expelled from Bulgaria going to Turkey. Probably this excursion, and the historian Paul Betts has written beautifully on this, can turn to be more important. And then I went into opinion polling, and in 2019, the Russian public was asked what was the most important thing that happened in 1989. And they have 5 options. They have Polish elections, they have Berlin Wall, they have Tiananmen. That 54% of them selected the withdrawal of Soviet troops from Afghanistan. And then 2 more things. 1989 for the political Islam was as important as for the liberals. Osama bin Laden believed that for the first time, Islamist movement has defeated a superpower.
You might think this is an allegory for a divorce. But no. The reunification of East Germany and West Germany. What we're led to question by this book, The Light That Failed, primary author is Ivan Krastev. Could it be that when these two halves were unified, in fact, what we need to ask ourselves is the extent to which Western liberalism was the specter haunting Europe and still is the phantom, the whole phantom person. Or perhaps the reunification reveals the extent to which both halves were more of a phantom than a man all along. Now, a large part of the argument presented by Krastev in this book, he places great emphasis on the fact that these countries we are talking about, they have not become destinations for Muslim refugees. They have not become destination for Muslim immigrants. The perception of this threat and crisis is twofold, in the author's opinion. On the one hand, these people, Hungarians, Romanians, and so on, they go and visit Berlin. They go and visit Vienna. They go and visit London. They see what's unfolding there, when they are overseas, when they're abroad, when they're touring the rest of Europe. So this is part of it. And if they do get a job and they live and work in one of these cities, it is quite likely that simply through poverty, they will be living in the same neighborhoods as new Muslim immigrants and Muslim refugees. So they may be more sensitive to, more aware of the disadvantages of multiculturalism in the Western liberal world. Oh, okay. So this is one point he makes. And then the second point that he's much more comfortable talking about in depth is the demographic collapse of all these countries after the end of communism, that Bulgaria has undergone the single greatest depopulation ever seen anywhere in the world under conditions of peacetime and in the absence of a plague. So Population of Bulgaria has dropped and is continuing to drop fast. Countries like Hungary, a large part of their defensive nationalism, isn't, in fact, defending themselves against Muslim immigrants and refugees coming over the border, although there's plenty of discourse about this, certainly a common right-wing narrative. In fact, the fear is that all of their talented and ambitious young people are leaving the country never to return. Now, if you are a qualified dentist living in Bucharest or living in Budapest, under the economic conditions of the European Union, you have the option to get up and leave and instead live in Berlin, instead live in Vienna, instead live in Paris. Many do. Many of these professionals who have wealth and mobility and qualifications, they leave the East behind, so to speak. They abandon their native land and go to live somewhere where they both have a better quality of life and also enjoy what we could simply call a better quality of democracy. They live in one of these liberal states with all of the disadvantages and advantages that go along with it, including being surrounded by drug addicts, being surrounded by prostitution, being surrounded by various kinds of crime and disorder and filth that, frankly, Western liberal society trains us all to tolerate, right? And they accept living in a multicultural society where they are one of the multiple cultures. They, as Hungarian immigrants, whether they be immigrants from Bucharest or Budapest or Sofia or otherwise, right? From any of these. Okay, so those people have left. Who remains? What type of dentist commits to continue living in either Budapest or Bucharest? Well, one reason why they might choose to earn less money, have a lower quality of life, and endure the vicissitudes of the peculiar political system that they have over there is because they are deeply committed to the future of the nation. One reason might be that they are deeply committed to raising their own children speaking this language, a language that only has economic disadvantages when compared to German, when compared to French, when compared to English, or even when compared to Russian. That they have decided that for whatever combination of reasons, they want to raise their children speaking Hungarian. Okay, so to say that there is a political polarization that emerges out of this demographic collapse, right? Demographic collapse partly caused by mass migration, right? And again, these countries we're talking about, they are not a destination for Muslim refugees or Muslim economic migrants, in as much as any of the refugees set foot in Budapest or Bucharest. As quick as they can, they leave. It's a transmigration point for them. They keep going to seek their fortune in France or Germany or England, occasionally Belgium or Sweden or what have you. You know, they do not want to remain in this part of Europe. So they may pass through, but in fact, they have not had a huge growth in this kind of population. What they have had is an indescribably immense evacuation of their own youth, their own talented and ambitious people. Anyone who has the money and self-confidence to get up and leave comes to the conclusion, as Krastev says again and again and again, rather than trying to transform the country they live in, rather than being committed to the political destiny of the nation, they will simply transform their own lives. They will simply relocate to a country that resembles their political preferences rather than engaging in a struggle to impose their political preferences on the country they happen to have been born in, or they happen to have the passport for, or where they speak the language. These are obvious facts that have been dangerously easy to ignore. In the year 1989, anyone with a brain could have said to the people of Budapest, the people of Bucharest, and the people of Sofia, and so on, anyone could have said to the populations of these countries in between Russia and Western Europe, look, don't kid yourself. If you sign up for this Western liberal world order, it means mass migration. and not just mass immigration, right? It means you are open to and embrace the possibility of having a significant Chinese minority in your major cities, significant Hindu minority, and yes, especially a Muslim minority, especially a Turkish minority. This is the model of free market capitalism you are choosing to embrace. A lot more is going to change than just the Communist Party closing its windows and shuttering its doors. And this is obvious. This already was obvious in 1989, in 1999, in 2009. And it's obvious now. The role of political science in the 21st century, increasingly, is not one of researching and establishing facts, of making mere numbers available to politicians and other decision makers. No. The facts have become cheap and obvious. Nobody particularly respects you for having done research and established facts. The role of political science, increasingly, is instead to confront us brutally with such obvious truths that have ceased to be obvious, because we live our lives surrounded by these various forms of propaganda that smooth those facts over and tell us not to worry. Anyone could have said to the populations of these countries, Bucharest, Budapest, and so on, if you embrace this model, this is what it means in terms of abortion. This is what it means in terms of gay rights. This is what it means in terms of the role of transgender people in your society. And this is what it's going to mean in terms of women's careers, women in the workforce, women having drastically fewer babies. The percentage of women who have children at all is fewer, and then the women who do have children have fewer children, so on and so forth. And the collapse of communism also created a transitional period of incredibly high mortality, self-destructive behavior that can be simplified by just saying it was alcoholism and drug addiction on an apocalyptic scale that people in that part of the world were not accustomed to. So suddenly, alcoholics and drug addicts were, and this also contributed to the demographic deficit that Krastev is philosophizing about. But now, 2025, the question is obviously, what now, what next? Krastev said in one of his lectures that the 20th century was the Jewish century. So obviously he's alluding to the overwhelming significance of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism in the 20th century. So the 20th century was the Jewish century, whereas the 21st century is the Israeli century. So this is quite provocative, interesting. He's suggesting that a certain style of defensive nationalism will become a standard model to challenge the very phony universal claims, the phantom claims, if you like, of Western neoliberalism, overturning the assumptions of The End of History and the Last Man by Francis Fukuyama and this sort of thing. In the same sense that Israel is a nation for Israelis. It's actually a multicultural country. However, obviously, Israel is unapologetically a kind of tiny empire for Israelis. It is not pretending to be what New York has pretended to be, what New York has written on the base of the Statue of Liberty, a phrase directly adapted from the author of the American Constitution, Gouverneur Morris, by the way. It is not the case that Israel is open to the poor and the oppressed and the downtrodden from all around the world. It's not the case that Israel is pretending to have a universal set of values that can welcome in and unify the immigrants from all over the world. It's the opposite of multiculturalism, but it's not monoculturalism. They include, Russian Jews who speak Russian as their first language and are culturally very Russian, Jews from Iran, Iraq, North Africa, Western Europe. So in that same sense, the Hungarians might be interested in having a Hungary, a country that exists for Hungarians in the same sense that Israel exists for Israelis. Okay. What we mean by liberalism in this context really is a result of the triumph and the tragedy of Napoleon. It's crazy how, the political significance of Napoleon remains everywhere talked about and yet nowhere understood. It's a kind of taboo. The founding fathers writing the American Constitution, that we're comfortable with. Francis Fukuyama presenting this insane theory that liberalism emerged from GWF Hegel. Hegel, who in fact is significant to the history of German fascism, and in case you forgot, Marxism and communism, that kind of happened in Germany too. It was powerfully connected to the philosophy of Hegel. So-called German liberalism and Hegelian liberalism, total nonsense. It's in Napoleon making the transition from a genuinely revolutionary, genuinely atheist neoclassical state, a state that tried to return to the virtues and the vices of ancient Rome, ancient Athens, ancient Sparta. He makes the transition, this instead being a kind of liberal democracy controlled by him and his brothers as a family business on the one side. Yes, yes, yes. But a democracy that extended these universal claims of egalitarian meritocratic citizenship to places like Poland, right? Exactly this battlefield that ultimately extends into Russia. I mean, the phantom limb we're struggling with here is ultimately because the map of Europe was dismembered by Napoleon himself. The model of what I guess you'd call universalist Unitarian liberalism, it's totally a consequence of the triumph and the tragedy of Napoleon, who, as soon as he was dead, was imitated by all of his enemies. So this is sort of model of defensive nationalism in this already aforementioned context of demographic collapse, the disempowerment of these languages, where there really is a question, will anyone speak Bulgarian 100 years from now? Will anyone speak Romanian? Will anyone speak Hungarian? This is much more intense than the threat to a language like German or a language like Russian, obviously. There is a real sense of panic that the nation as they know it can cease to exist, that their literature can become a literature written in a dead language or a language that is, very much subordinated to some international language like English, most likely language, so on and so forth. Right? Okay. The book closes with this comparison to China and asking the question of to what extent we, with our Eurocentric bias, have been focused entirely on the fall of the Berlin Wall, ignoring what happened in Turkey and Bulgaria in 1989, ignoring what happened in China in 1989, quite a few other historically significant events in that one year. Maybe the real significance of the year 1989 was what China proved to the world, rather than what happened with Gorbachev, the fall of the Berlin Wall, so on and so forth. Okay, there are really several other points of comparison around the map are totally missing from this book and totally missing from the lectures he's given in the years thereafter. I think I should point out here, more or less abruptly. This idea of imitating America. Is the problem with the act of imitation, or is it the set of expectations of wealth and power that should ensue as a natural consequence of this imitation? Mexico. Mexico is in part an imitation of the political system in the United States of America, and it's in part an imitation of Spain. Okay? Any of you in this audience would prefer to live in Madrid than to live in Mexico City. Mexico is a disaster. The whole period of history from 1989 to September 11th, 2001, from September 11th, 2001 to the current day in the year 2025, the history of Mexico has been a disappointing disaster. Okay? Why would the Hungarians expect the imitation of the American model to be more successful for Hungary than it was for Mexico? Why? This model of imitation, we can't think about this symbolically or psychologically. In a game of chess, if you sacrifice a pawn, that serves the purpose of winning the game of chess, no more, no less. There is no point in assigning symbolic significance to the pawn. There's no point in assigning psychological significance to the pawn. This is a move made within the game of chess for the purpose of winning the game of chess. Why does Mexico imitate the United States of America in its political policies, social planning, so on and so forth? Why do they also imitate Spain? Because they think it's going to work. Because there are real world outcomes they desire and they pursue. They want to have working hospitals and an education sector and so on and so forth throughout their whole society, right? I mean, they want to have working elections and a working police force. They want to eliminate organized crime, which is a huge problem in Mexico. Haiti, although it has not been imitating the American government since its revolution, certainly since the period of American military occupation, when it was directly governed by the United States Marine Corps, Haiti now has a very long history of directly imitating the United States of America. Why? Why? You can talk about self-hatred and low self-esteem, and he does, by the way. It's very much Krastev's approach. You can talk about the colonial mentality. Black is beautiful as opposed to feeling inferior. You can look at Haiti this way. I feel this whole psychological and symbolic approach, this cultural anthropology approach to the question, is utterly misleading. No, Haiti, countries throughout the Caribbean, throughout South America, and around the world, they imitated American political policies. They're trying to win. How do you want to put this? They are trying to have a successful economy, farming sector, international trade. They want all of the advantages that the American model of free market liberalization seemingly, if not actually, offers them. The paradox here is not to question the reasons why these countries in Europe, the post-communist countries, imitated America, imitated England, imitated France, imitated Germany, right? This neoliberal model that was presented to them. The question is why they didn't expect it to end up as a disaster like Mexico or like Haiti. And I think that's the real story of racism here. I think there is a real delusional sense in which the people of Romania still believe they are special just because they are descendants of people who participated in the Roman Empire. That's what the country is named after. I think that all these symbols of, eagles on flags really make these people think that the laws of physics don't apply to them the same way that they apply to people in South America, for example, or throughout all of Africa. This is a long and diverse history of imitating. Look, we could get into Cambodia too. We could get into East Asian, examples. The possibility of failure and the defects and disadvantages of liberalization and what liberalism really means, just to this mystifying extent, it seems to me that everyone's been lying to themselves. Several reasons why you might be listening to this video so many years after the book was published. It might be that you're watching a review of the book with a sincere interest in reading the book. It's more likely that you read the book yourself years ago and you can't quite now remember what its significance was. You're hoping this discussion is going to refresh your memory and revive your interest. And then there's a third category. There will be people who have seen the YouTube videos and podcasts and lectures that the author, Ivan Krastev, is still engaged in, is still authoring to this day, pushing forward in this discourse that, from my perspective, reading in English began with this hit book in the fateful year of 2019. Part of the book has aged badly. The final portion of the book suddenly shifts to questioning the extent to which the legacy of the year 1989 really, truly was what happened in China, the Tiananmen Square massacre, the suppression of pro-democracy protests in China, that we need to radically reevaluate our Eurocentric perspective by looking at the Chinese example, what happened. Part of the book is an examination of the relationship between Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump. And of course, this has aged badly. It would have been impossible for the author to write that part of the book in a way that would still be significant to this day. However, in between these two extremes, The book discusses the politics of the countries in between Russia and Western Europe. Countries including Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania, and it is one of the only books you can read in English, taking seriously, dealing with questions of the fate of these nations. So this part of the book has aged well, and I assume for the next 10 years, the career of Ivan Krastev in sort of philosophizing about and theorizing about these nations, these economies, he's set. There are so few voices in English, spoken or written, that are in any way, examining what has happened and what will happen next in that part of the world with all due profundity and all due seriousness. The theoretical coat hanger that he uses to denude the right wing and clothe Western liberalism is the notion that the modernization, democratization, and liberalization of this expanse of Central and Eastern Europe had to fail because it was imitative. It had to be resented because it was an imitation of the West. And on the contrary, clearly, it is resented not because it is an imitation, but because it is a failure. I can refute him just by drawing attention to other observations that are mixed into his book and that have reemerged in his lectures since the book was published. There was a false expectation that Bucharest and Budapest would instantaneously become equal to Vienna in quality of life, quality of democracy, economic power, so on and so forth, in the same sense that the two sides of Berlin, East Berlin and West Berlin, and more broadly, East Germany and West Germany, very rapidly merged, integrated, and equalized in terms of quality of life and quality of democracy. That is not what could ever happen for Romania, and it's not what could ever happen for the Hungarians, precisely because of these issues of nationalism, language, cultural destiny, and a kind of defensive view of why the government exists that is in some ways strangely akin to Israel. There are many other really salient examples that I think have to be juxtaposed to clarify what it is that a country like Hungary is going through right now. I can't remember Krastev mentioning Japan even once. In the period from 1989 to September 11th, 2001, the outcomes of imitating American-style liberalism were terrible, were a disappointment, were a disaster everywhere except Japan. In the period from September 11, 2001 to present, I think there's a pretty solid argument in the whole world. The only positive example of imitating the West, Western liberalism, America, and to some extent places like France, is Japan. This is a model. It's not resented because of the psychology of imitation, because of this sense that you're second rate. You no longer pursue a utopian ideal presented to you by Marxism, communism, so on and so forth, or presenting the pursuit of an ideal from ancient Rome, ancient Greece, ancient Sparta. No. You're now pursuing the imitation of an already existing, quite mediocre society. A society that has no profound answers to offer you when, for example, the economy falls apart in the 2008 housing crisis, when coronavirus happens, various vicissitudes of history come and go, and it's actually quite clear that the people with long beards and PhDs in Berlin have no great wisdom to offer you, and this is what you're supposed to be looking up to now, instead of the literature of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, or the ideology of communism, Marxism, and so forth. It's all a little bit shabby, this cycle of imitating actually existing democracies instead of pursuing some refined ideal, or pursuing a kind of sense of national destiny of one's own, sense that Hungary is going to be something special, unique for Hungarians. It's not derivative of, it's not a second-rate imitation of New York or Los Angeles, whatever it is that's supposed to be so wonderful about life in New York or Los Angeles or Paris or Berlin. They're all terrible places to live, especially if you're poor. These are all countries that are signing up to be poverty-stricken second-rate invitations. Okay, but, isn't it strange how reluctant we are to include Japan, and yes, y'all, India, in this mix, and to recognize that across a tremendous diversity of cultures, right, we are still very recognizably talking about liberalism and neoliberalism, right? Japan isn't an alternative to neoliberalism. We can't say Japan has a different model of society from Mexico or even Haiti. It's simply that the Japanese have succeeded where others have failed. And likewise, if we're really being honest, it's just not reasonable to criticize Viktor Orban as if he represents the antithesis of liberalism and neoliberalism. I hate to tell you this, Benjamin Netanyahu, even Vladimir Putin, none of these people are really presenting an alternative to neoliberalism. They are simply playing this same game of chess, and they are playing to win. When you see them sacrifice a pawn, when you see them sacrifice a queen, you have to understand that sacrifice is still in the pursuit of a goal that, frankly, I think the American Empire, the British Empire, can all understand a little too well.